to Psalm 57. One place, Psalm 57, one place I do not like to be is in a cave. Does anybody here like being in a cave? You just look forward to saying, I'd like to take a vacation and book a cave. I don't like being in a cave, but there is one time that maybe you would be grateful for a cave, and that is if you were out somewhere and a storm was coming. I don't remember all the details. I wished I'd paid more attention to the things my dad told me, but I do remember him telling me one time he was driving. His job required him to do a lot of driving, and he was driving and a storm was brewing, and it got quite bad, and actually he was in an area where there was a tornado. He decided he needed to stop the car and get out of the car and seek some shelter, but he couldn't find anywhere near, so he simply pulled over and made his way around the back of the car and rolled down into the ditch until the tornado passed by. Nearby farm buildings were damaged, and I'm sure that Dad was grateful he made it through that storm, but maybe then he would have rather been in a cave. Any situation that I can imagine, I wouldn't want to be in a cave any longer than I had to be in a cave. You know, there are two Psalms in the Bible that have in their heading, in the cave. A Psalm of David when he was in the cave. And this Psalm is one of them. Let me give you a little background about the Psalms before we read our text. In his book, Tremper Longman III, in his book, How to Read the Psalms, he also wrote a commentary, the Expositor's Bible Commentary. Great books on the Psalms, especially How to Read the Psalms is very simple and insightful and helpful. But he says in the Psalms there are 7 different types of genre or literature within the Psalms themselves. And they must be read that way. But one of those 7 kinds of Psalms is what we have called a lament. A lament. Now, Tremper Longman also identifies at least 7 elements of a lament. Now, in the lament we're looking at today, we're only going to see 3. They don't all appear in all of the laments. But have you ever read a psalm, for example, and you had to scratch your head and said, well, I don't know if he should have said that. I mean, he talks about his enemies being, obliterated or something, and you say, I'm not sure he should have said that. Why is that in the Scripture? Well, that's a part of the lament. And one of the elements of a lament is a complaint. And I know we're always saying, you shouldn't complain, you shouldn't complain. But a complaint in the Bible is where the author is in great distress and he brings his feelings to the Lord. And he writes them under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. So when you read those Psalms, he's not saying, the Bible is not saying that's the way you always ought to feel. It's saying that's the way he felt. And he's dealing with that. And he's bringing that to the Lord. How many of you have ever had some feelings you weren't sure you should have, but you needed to bring them to the Lord? And maybe you weren't at peace talking to other people about them. And maybe if you did talk to other people about them, they weren't at peace listening. Because they don't want to hear your complaint. But what do we do with our complaints? What do we do with those things that trouble us, bother us? We bring them to the Lord. And that's a part of lament, this complaint part of it. And then in a lament, you'll find somewhere in the lament, you'll see him expressing his feelings, but then there'll be a declaration of trust. In the midst of his feelings, he reaffirms his trust. And then there's usually somewhere near the end, but at other places, praise and thanksgiving. And you get the feeling as you go through that lament that joy has now emerged in the midst of sorrow. Well, here's what's going on in Psalm 57. Let's just take a quick look at the heading, and I'm reading it today out of the English Standard Version. It says, to the choir master according to, or to be sung with, or to the tune of, do not destroy. That was something they knew about, a tune. Miktam of David when he fled from Saul in the cave. When he fled from Saul in a cave. Now we know basically the historical setting. He's fleeing from Saul. He was anointed to be king, but yet Saul was on the throne. And Saul has fallen from grace. There are times when an evil spirit comes over Saul. And Saul is mad at times, almost crazy at times. And here's David playing in his courts, trying to soothe his troubled mind, Saul's troubled mind. And Saul throws javelins at him. Here's a little hint. If someone's throwing a javelin at you, you might want to think about leaving. You might want to think that that's a good time to find an exit door. And David flees away. It's clear Saul wants to kill him. And in 1 Samuel, we read the whole story. And there are two caves in 1 Samuel that are named. One is Adullam, chapter 22 of 1 Samuel. So maybe this psalm was about when he was at Adullam. Adullam is that place where he was hiding from Saul. And all these people who were in distress or whatever were gathering unto him. So it must have been a big cave. But he's in the cave. And Saul has wiped out 85 priests just because they helped David. Saul has 3,000 chosen men who are armed soldiers trying to hunt down David. And David finds himself having to flee, unjustly hunted down. And he's hiding. And he's in a cave. The other cave that it might be is En-Gedi, which is in 1 Samuel 24. Remember where he's hiding in the cave with some of his men. And Saul comes in there to relieve himself. And his men say, hey, now's your chance. Kill him, kill him. And he chooses not to. He simply cuts a piece of his garment off, sneaks up and cuts some of the garment to prove that he could have killed him, but he didn't. So maybe that's the cave. We don't know which cave, but we know he was in a cave. And I want to look at that whole idea of being in a cave. What does that represent? Being in a cave represents where you don't want to be there. Nobody wants to be in a cave. Not when you've had your own bed, not when you have your own luxuries, not when you have a regular dwelling place. You don't want to live in a cave, but David's in a cave. This cave represents those times in our life where we find ourselves a storm brewing around us. And in order for safety, for protection, we have to go to the cave. And so the cave is not where we want to be. And a good part of the time while we're in the cave, we're dreaming about getting out of the cave. But here's what I want you to remember. For the time being, the cave, though not where you want to be, the cave is probably where you need to be. The cave has its purpose. God is doing something in the cave. The cave represents those tumultuous times in our life. David puts it this way. He's trusting in the Lord. And he says, till the storms of destruction pass by. I'm in this place until the storms of destruction pass by. There's storms all around me trying to destroy me, so I'm in a cave. You're in a circumstance. You're in a situation. It's not what you chose. It's not what you want. And it's not going to be for the rest of your life. But for now, you're in a cave. It can be a lonely place. It can be a dark place. It can be a place of discouragement, or it can become a place of victory. But you're in a cave. And so let's read this text together, and you'll see about David in the cave. And as we're going through this, let me just give you my outline. There's a definite structure to the psalm itself. It's beautiful. The first part is his prayer, and then there's a doxology almost, and then the last part is his praise, ended again with a doxology. You'll see complaint in here. You'll see trust in God in here. You'll see an attitude of thanksgiving and praise in here. And what we're going to be looking at is things to remember when you're in a cave. When you're in that place where there's storms all around you, things you didn't choose, things you don't want, but here you are. And you probably need to be in this cave, because it's in the cave God does certain things in us, certain works within us. Let's read it. I'll read the heading too, which is an actual part of the psalm. To the choir master, according to Do Not Destroy, a miktam of David when he fled from Saul in the cave. Be merciful to me, O God, be merciful to me, for in you my soul takes refuge. In the shadow of your wings I will take refuge till the storms of destruction pass by. I cry out to God Most High, to God who fulfills his purpose for me. He will send from heaven and save me. He will put to shame him who tramples on me. God will send out his steadfast love and his faithfulness. My soul is in the midst of lions. I lie down among fiery beasts, the children of man whose teeth are spears and arrows, whose tongues are sharp swords. See, there's people out to get him, out to kill him. This is his complaint. And then the doxology, verse 5. Be exalted, O God, above the heavens. Let your glory be over all the earth. They set a net for my steps. My soul was bowed down. There again is complaint. They dug a pit in my way, but they are fallen into it themselves. My heart is steadfast, O God. My heart is steadfast. I will sing and make melody. Awake, my glory. Awake, O harp and lyre. I will awake the dawn. I will give thanks to you, O Lord, among the peoples. I will sing praise to you among the nations, for your steadfast love is great to the heavens, and your faithfulness to the clouds. Be exalted, O God, above the heavens. Let your glory be over all the earth. And so there you saw his complaint. My soul is bowed down. They're surrounding me. Their teeth, their mouth, they're like swords and spears. They're all out to get me, Lord. But notice the declarations of trust. Notice the great declarations of thanksgiving. Well, here's my outline. Things to remember when you are in the cave. Maybe you feel like you're in one right now. Maybe you can't wait to get out, and I understand that. And you will get out. But while you're in the cave, let's remember these things. Here's our outline. A, B, A, B. A is we're going to see something we need to remember about God when we're in the cave. And then we're going to see something about the believer that we need to remember when we're in the cave. And then something about God when we're in the cave. And then something about the believer when we're in the cave. So let's put it this way. God, you. Something about God, something about you, something about God, something about you. There's a pattern to make it memorable. And this psalm was written in a certain structure that it could be sung to this. We don't even know this tune, Do Not Destroy, but it was to be sung. There's another psalm that has a heading that says, In the Cave. And that's Psalm 142. We'll be quoting from it later. But let's take out our study guide. Let's go through this together. What should we remember when we're in a cave? And maybe you're in a cave right now. Number one, simply put this down. Remember the refuge of God. Something of God. The refuge of God. What is refuge? Refuge, your translation we have, I know you bring all different kinds of translations. I was reading from the English Standard, but many different translations, some of which would, rather than use the word refuge, would use the word trust. Under the shadow of your wings, I will trust, rather than I will take refuge. Here's why. The word refuge here means to flee to for protection, to confide in, to put trust in, to make a refuge, to confidence or hope in God. So some translations say, my soul trusts, or my soul takes or makes refuge. But the thing to remember when we're going through a period of storm, where there's upheaval in our life, there's the storms of destruction all around us. You're in the cave. You're in the cave because of the storm, not because you want to be there, but because of the storm. But the thing you need to remember foremost is God is your refuge. Your real place of safety is not just a physical dwelling, even if it's a cave. God wants to be your safety. God Himself, His presence, His work, His influence in your life, that is your safety. Time and time again, you can trace it through, and there are many scriptures in your study guide, especially in the Psalms, where God is declared to be the refuge. The refuge is a place of safety, and many of the Psalms were written when David was fleeing for his life. So he's looking for a place of safety. There's a storm that could destroy. Where do I go? How many of you have ever been in a tornado? I know you live in Southern California. We don't get a lot of them out here, probably many years since we've had one out here. But I grew up in an area where there were tornadoes, and the siren would go off, and what would you do? You'd want to find a place of safety. Usually down under the surface of the earth, somebody's basement or some kind of shelter. I remember a tornado when I was in college, and we all went to the underbelly, so to speak, of the basketball auditorium, where there's all these cement walls. You try and find a solid place when there's a storm. And you run to that place. And the place you run to is your refuge. And by the way, what you're really trusting in is where you run. And when the storm is brewing and you feel the storm coming upon you, you find out in that moment what you're really trusting in, because it's where you run. That's where you've been trusting. And so refuge and trust, they go hand in hand. Psalm 9:9, the Lord will also be a refuge in times of trouble. Psalm 46, God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. In many of these Psalms, you see these common elements: trust, refuge, trouble, storm. On and on. Lord of hosts is with us. God of Jacob is our refuge. Oh, Psalm 59:16, refuge in the day of trouble. Refuge, I pour out my heart before him. God is refuge. Psalm 62:8. Psalm 91:2, refuge and fortress. He is my refuge and fortress. Because God has made the Lord, which is my refuge, even the Most High. Thou hast made the Lord, which is my refuge. The Lord is my defense. The Lord is my rock. The Lord is my refuge. You get the feel of it, don't you? There's a storm brewing, and this storm is all around me. Where do I go? Do I just roll into a ditch and hope it goes by me? Or do I find a cave? And you might be in a cave today because you feel like a storm has hit your life that you didn't plan on. You didn't cause it, but it's there. And you need to find that refuge. And I want to tell you, the first thing to remember more than anything else, God himself wants to be your refuge. God's very own presence wants to sustain you. More than going to any other physical location, God's presence wants to be your shelter. God's presence wants to be your rock, wants to be your fortress. There are many experiences in our life where we look back on them. They're over now. And we look back on those dark days, and we look back on that storm of destruction that tried to take away from us. And we say, how did I get through that? How did we make it? There are times I look back on different events or periods in my life, and I say, I can't point to any specific thing that got me through it. And then I realize he got me through it. He was my refuge. And although it uses a different word for refuge, I love this passage, Deuteronomy 32:27. The eternal God is your refuge, and underneath are the everlasting arms. How did you get through that storm? He became your refuge. And literally, you know what that's saying? Underneath are the everlasting arms. That's a picture of he carried you like a young child. So I don't know how I got through it. Well, I know how you got through it. I can't necessarily explain it other than to say he carried you through it. Because he was your refuge. Psalm 27:5. For in a time of trouble, he shall hide me in his pavilion. In the secret place of his tabernacle, he shall hide me. He shall set me high upon a rock. Psalm 31:20. You shall hide them in the secret of your presence. That's your refuge. So when that storm is brewing, here's what the enemy wants to do. The enemy always wants to steal, to take away, to destroy. But one thing the enemy wants to do is he wants you to be separated from the presence of God. Your heart is filled with anxiety. Your mind is filled with worry. You're not enjoying the presence of God, and yet God's presence is your refuge. It is that secret place. You will hide them in the secret place of your presence. Nahum 1:7, the Lord is good, a stronghold in the day of trouble, and he knows those who trust in him. Are you in a time of a storm? Let God be your refuge. And David here uses a beautiful picture. He says, in the shadow of your wings, I will take refuge. In the shadow of your wings, I will trust. You could translate it. And several times in the psalm we read that phrase, shadow of your wings, and most of them include the word trust. Ruth, in the book of Ruth 2:12, the Lord recompense thy worth, and a full reward be given thee of the Lord God of Israel, under whose wings thou art have come to trust. Psalm 37:7, how excellent is thy loving kindness, O God. Therefore the children of men put their trust under the shadow of your wings. Psalm 61:4, I will abide in thy tabernacle forever. I will trust in the covert of thy wings. Psalm 91:4, he shall cover thee with his feathers, and under his wings thou shalt trust. He will be your truth. His truth shall be your shield and buckler. Keep me as the apple of the eye. Psalm 17:8, hide me under the shadow of your wings. Psalm 57:1, we've read it. Psalm 63:7, therefore in the shadow of thy wings I will rejoice. So this place of God's presence is like a bird covering you with his wings to protect you, and it's God himself. We run for answers. We want some other solution, and God would say, wait a minute, I just want you to lean fully on me. I am your answer. I am your shelter. I am your refuge. Come on into my presence. Find that secret place. This is your cave. This is where you will be kept from the storm. God is our refuge. Years ago, I read an article that was in National Geographic after a forest fire in Yellowstone National Park. The rangers went up to the area that had been burned and were just inspecting the area, and they saw the destruction and the burning and the charred trees and everything. And they saw at the base of one tree, it looked like a statue of a bird. It wasn't moving. It was black as could be from being burnt. And one ranger went over and went to poke it with a stick, and it was solid. It had just been burned through to a crisp, you would say. And as he pushed it with that stick, it fell over just like a stone statue would fall over. But underneath, there were live chicks that came out, baby birds. And what had happened is that bird must have been up in the tree with her nest, and knowing that feeling the heat and knowing that toxic gases would be rising, that bird got its chicks down at the base of the tree where it would be best to breathe and best chance of survival, and covered the chicks with its own body and refused to leave even though the flames were burning it. What a picture underneath the wings. And how Jesus was willing to endure all for us, that under his wings we would find a shelter from the storms of destruction. And so we're in a cave. And the first thing to remember when you're in that cave is that God himself is your refuge. You cannot make it without him. You must not first run anywhere else. Run to him. He is your refuge. And when the storm passes, you'll have more than survived. When the storm is over, you will have more than safety. You will have a depth of experience with God you wouldn't have had any other way, because he is your refuge. He was your secret keeping place, hiding place. What should you remember when you're in the cave? Number one, God, the refuge of God. Number two, when you're in the cave, remember the responsibility of the believer. The responsibility of the believer. And yes, for memory's sake, they all start with R. The refuge of God, that's something you need to remember about God. That's A. Now B, something to remember about the believer. The responsibility. You have a responsibility when you're in that cave. You cannot simply be in that cave and say, everything will work out, everything will pass, I'm just going to be here. No, you must be in the cave, but there is a responsibility that you have while you're in that cave. And it's very simple. I cry out. I cry out. Be merciful to me, O God, be merciful to me, for in you my soul takes refuge. In the shadow of your wings I will take refuge till the storms of destruction pass by. I cry out to God Most High, to God who fulfills his purpose for me. I cry out to God. I cry out to God. That is your responsibility. Your responsibility is not to take everything into your own hands with your own ingenuity, with your own initiative. That might have been a part of the mess you're in to start with. Your responsibility is to cry out to God. Because a true crying out to God represents a brokenness. A true crying out to God represents a desperate dependence, a desperate acknowledging that you cannot make it without God. If God indeed is your refuge, then what is your responsibility? Your responsibility is to cry out to God. And this is an act of utter humility. God, I can do nothing. God, I must first cry out. I need you, God. Come, help. Here's how David worded it. Be merciful to me, O God. Be merciful to me, because I trust in you. What is he doing? He's crying out. He's crying out. And there must be this brokenness that comes from a realization that we depend totally upon God. We've already said God is our refuge, but we need to cry out to Him. And there are times when God will allow the storm to so shake your life that you realize you really have little else besides Him. And so you cry out to Him. As we've quoted Corrie ten Boom several times, she said this, it's so wise. She said, "You will never know that God is all that you need until you experience that He's all that you have." You'll never know that God is all that you need until He's all that you have. Until you're stripped away from everything else you could be leaning on, relying on, running to. And you say, "God, you are my refuge. There is nowhere else to run. God, I need you. I desperately need you." You cry out. This is our responsibility to cry out. And the Psalms are filled with phrases and scriptures and declarations of crying out to God. You have many of them listed in your study guide, and they seem quite repetitive. I cried, and then you'll see He heard. I cried, and He gave me His ear. I cried, and He delivered. I cried, and He saved. This poor man cried, and the Lord heard and delivered him. Time and time again throughout the Psalms, you see that scenario. I cried, He heard. I cried, He heard. He saved, He delivered. But our responsibility is to cry out. I asked Ramsey to repeat this again in the bulletin. Look at it if you will. It's called Our Prayer is God's Opportunity by S.D. Gordon, an excerpt taken from the book How to Live a Life of Prayer. A good, inexpensive book. I encourage you to buy one. All these excerpts of great men of God about prayer. But here's what he says. In its simplest analysis, all prayer must have two parts. First, a God to give, and second, a man to receive. Man's willingness is God's channel to the earth. God never crowds or coerces. Everything God does for man and through man, He does with man's consent, always. Let it be said that God can do nothing for the man with a shut hand and a shut life. There must be an open hand and heart and life through which God can give what He longs to. An open life, an open hand, is the pipeline of communication between the heart of God and this poor world. Our prayer is God's opportunity to get into the world that shuts Him out. Our prayer is God's opportunity to get into the world that shuts Him out. God is looking for people who will open up with all their heart and in a sense of trust and dependency cry out to Him. No one can do that on your behalf. That's your responsibility. He is our refuge, but we have a responsibility. I would encourage you this week to go through all those Psalms. I cried, He heard. I cried, He delivered. I cried, and He heard. He gave me His ear, but it all is triggered by our crying. Our pouring our hearts out to God in utter dependence and brokenness. Psalm 32, I cried, He healed. Psalm 34:6, I cried, He heard and saved. Psalm 77:1, I cried, and He gave ear unto me. 107:6, I cried, He delivered. 107:13, I cried, He saved. You get the feel, don't you? Something happens when you cry. I cried with my whole heart. I cried, and He heard. I cried, Psalm 138:3, when I cried, Thou answered me, and strengthenest me with strength in my soul. Sometimes you don't get the strength you need until you're crying out to God in utter weakness. That's that great paradox, isn't it? That in our weakness we find His strength. And in our weakness we say, God, all I can do is cry out to You. And then He strengthens your soul. Psalm 142, another psalm of when you're in the cave. I cried unto the Lord with my voice unto the Lord did I make my supplication. I cried unto Thee, O Lord, and said, Thou art my refuge and my portion in the land of the living. What does that mean, my portion? Notice he's gotten to the point where he says, God, You're why I live. You're everything to me. You're my portion. You're what I want out of life. I want You. And so there's a storm of destruction around you. And you're in the cave. And while you're in that cave, will you humble yourself and allow a brokenness to come into your life wherein all you can do is cry out. That's our responsibility. There are some things we cannot fix. Only God can fix. We must cry out. Cry out. New Testament uses the word supplication, that desperateness in prayer because of a deep need. But look at verse 1 of our psalm, Psalm 57:1. Be merciful to me, O God, be merciful to me, for in you my soul takes refuge. That word mercy, we could be saying, give favor to me, God, give favor to me. That Hebrew word means to stoop down in kindness to an inferior. To stoop down in kindness to an inferior. And I don't know if this is really what the word is saying, but in my mind, here's what I pictured. I pictured a warrior, battle-hardened, strong, victorious warrior, stooping down to help a child. And I see God as a warrior. I see Jesus as strong in battle and mighty in war. And yet he'll stoop down to help his children. And here's David surrounded by Saul and these 3,000 choice men, the best of the best, the cream of the crop. And there he is in the cave. And he's saying, God, stoop down to me. I am an inferior, but stoop down to me in kindness, O Lord. Stoop down to me in kindness. Psalm 86:3, be merciful unto me, O Lord, for I cry unto thee daily. That's our responsibility, to cry out to God. Psalm 142:1, we've already quoted it. He used the word supplication as well as crying out unto the Lord. So here we are, we're in a cave. What do we remember? God is refuge. What do we remember? I need to crawl out. I need to cry out. I need to utterly throw myself upon God in an attitude of desperate prayer, believing that God will have mercy, because in him I trust. He is my refuge. He is my strength, my rock, my fortress. But I have to cry out to him. And so we see A, refuge of God. B, responsibility of believer. Now A again, something of God. Let's look at the response of God. The response of God. Look again with me at the psalm. I cry out to God Most High, to God who fulfills his purpose for me. He will send. This is the response of God. To those that truly in trust are crying out to him, the response of God is he will send. I want you to repeat this with me, not just because I want to wake you up. Just turn to somebody right now and say, wake up. This might get better, so wake up. But I want you to get this down in your mind. I want you to get it down in your heart. Just a little phrase. I want you to repeat it after me. I will cry. Say that. I will cry. He will send. I will cry. He will send. I will cry. He will send. Well, what is God's response? I cry, he sends. See, we want to take it into our own hands and try and do it all. No, we cry, he sends. There is a response from God when God's people put their trust in him. He's their refuge. And then we cry out. I cry, he sends. I cry, he sends. Remember that. Simple. I cry, he sends. There will be a response of God when we truly cry out. Maybe it's not as immediate as we want, but there will be a response of God. I cry, he sends. There are three things that he will send, or three responses is a better way to put it. We're only going to look at them two of them today. You say, what about the third one? Stay tuned. We're going to have a whole message on the third one. You got to stay tuned. This is a commercial. The third one is you need to stay tuned. But I want to look at two of them right from our text itself. What is God's response? God's response can be summed up in these words. He will send. In other words, I know I'm being rather vague purposefully. God will do something. Now, why am I so vague about, well, God will do something? Well, because I don't know what he will do. And neither do you. And you're only setting yourself up either to miss it or be discouraged if you think you need to figure out what he will do before he does it. Just believe that when you cry, he will send. He will do something in your situation. And he might do something you never thought of. He might do something you never saw coming. And you'll turn around and you'll say, wow, God, you are awesome. I never would have thought of that. See, he'll send what he knows you need at the time he knows you need it. Your responsibility is to cry. Cry out. I cry, he sends. I cry, he sends. Now, the first thing that it says he sends from heaven is rather vague, but I'll explain it to you. He will send from heaven and save. Now, the Old Testament word for save is a little different than the Christian word for save. When I say, are you saved? I mean, we take that, are you going to heaven? But the New Testament word for save is sozo, and it includes more than just going to heaven. It's a wholeness of life. It can include healing or deliverance, a wholeness of life, as well as save from your sins and going to heaven. And the Old Testament word used here, Hebrew word yasha, it simply means to be open, out in the open, or free, to be safe, to get victory, to be delivered. The idea is you're being confined, you're being pressed in, you're not free. And salvation is what frees you. Can you see how that fits David's context? He's in a cave. He's being hunted down by Saul's men. They want to destroy him. As he describes them, their teeth are like spears and arrows. Their tongues are sharp swords. These men have all surrounded me, and they're out to get me. They're out to kill me. I cry unto you, he will send, and he will save. So don't try and figure out what God is going to do. Just know that as you cry out to him, God will do something to save, something to bring about deliverance, something to bring about his purpose in your life. He will save. Psalm 17:7, show thy marvelous loving kindness, O thou that savest by thy right hand them which put their trust in you. Psalm 18:3, I will call upon the Lord. There he is calling out again. Who is worthy to be praised. So shall I be saved from my enemies. Notice there's a connection. I will call upon the Lord. So shall I be saved. I cry, he sends. I cry, he sends. He sends from heaven and he saves. Psalm 26. Now I know the Lord saves his anointed. He will hear from his holy heaven with the saving strength of his right hand. Oh, isn't that a great strong phrase? The saving strength of his right hand. I don't know what he's going to do. I don't know how he's going to do it. I don't even know when he's going to do it. But I cry and he sends. And he sends from heaven and he saves. Psalm 34:6, this poor man cried to the Lord, unto the Lord, and the Lord heard him and saved him out of all his troubles, these storms around me, these troubles. Psalm 138:7, though I walk in the midst of trouble, thou wilt revive me. See, God's going to do something in you when you're in the cave. Thou wilt revive me. Thou shalt stretch forth thy hand against the wrath of mine enemies, and thy right hand shall save me. Psalm 145:19, he will fulfill the desires of them that fear him. He will also hear their cry, and he will save them. I don't know how, I don't know what, but he'll do something. He hasn't forgotten you in the cave. He's your refuge. And your responsibility is to call out to him, to cry out to him. But his response is, he will send from heaven and save. Somehow he will do something. Isaiah 45:22, look unto me and be saved, all the ends of the earth, for I am God, and there is none else. So why are we looking to any else? Why are we running to anything else? He says, I am God. There is no else. No, there is none else. Look unto me and be saved. Isn't that a part of New Testament salvation? Call on the name of the Lord. Romans 10:9-13. Whosoever shall call on the name of the Lord shall be saved. I call, I cry, he sends. I cry, he sends. He sends from heaven. And I want to show something else. Here's the third purpose, or the third thing God is going to do. We're not going to even discuss it. I'm just going to mention it. It's a beautiful thought, though. I cry out to God Most High, to God who fulfills his purpose in me. You've got to remember that when you're in the cave, God has not forgotten the purpose he has for your life. And God will fulfill his purpose for you if you cry out to him. David, think of David. David is anointed to be king, and he's being hunted as a dog. But David says, I'm going to cry out to God, and God will fulfill his purpose for me. Later on, he says, I will sing your praise to the nations. Well, who can sing to the nations? Maybe a king. Maybe a king can do that. So he knows God's going to fulfill his purpose. You got to remember that when you're in the cave. This storm is not going to void out the purpose of God in your life. Matter of fact, God's going to do something if you cry out to him. Refuge of God, responsibility of believer, response of God, he will send. He will send. He will send from heaven and save. Now there's something else he will send. God will send out his steadfast love and his faithfulness. Verse 3 and verse 10 uses these two words together. Hesed in the Hebrew, steadfast love. Emeth, it means faithfulness or truth. So your translations, depending on which Bible you're reading out of, might say something like long-suffering or mercy and truth or whatever. But I love the way this version translates it, steadfast love. What is steadfast love? It's the love of the covenant. It's Hesed. God has entered into a covenant with you, and he says, I'm going to love you, and I'm going to act in my love toward you because you are in covenant with me. And a part of covenant is that God is faithful to his covenant. Now, I know this seems rather abstract, and again, it is purposefully so. But when you are in the cave, you must remember that when you cry out, God will send. But what will he send? I don't want you to miss this. We think of some kind of physical miracle or some kind of financial supply, and maybe God will include that. But what God will send that will make a difference in your life for the rest of your life is his steadfast love and his faithfulness. When in the midst of the storm, you know that nothing can separate you from the love of God. When you are persuaded that neither life, nor death, nor angel, nor principality, nothing can separate you from the love of God. There in your cave, there in the darkness, there in the dampness of the cave, there he sends his love. And even though you haven't found deliverance yet, you're experiencing his love in a way you've not yet experienced it before. Because there in the cave, he comes to you. And he comes to you with his steadfast love. And he reminds you once again that he loves you. And that he's faithful. Even in my own unfaithfulness, he reminds me, I love you. And God would say, I am faithful. And let those two thoughts be your strength when you're in the cave. His steadfast love and his faithfulness. God will send out his steadfast love and his faithfulness. Verse 10 of our text, for your steadfast love is great to the heavens and your faithfulness to the clouds. In other words, they go way beyond what we could handle or understand. What is it going to get me through? Psalm 69:13. In an acceptable time, O God, in the abundance of your steadfast love, answer me in your saving faithfulness. Whoa, what is packed into that verse? Let me read it slowly. Psalm 69:13. In an acceptable time, O God, in the abundance of your steadfast love, answer me in your saving faithfulness. Many times, many of them are listed in your study guide, where in the Psalms these two words are given together, steadfast love and faithfulness. Steadfast love and faithfulness. Psalm 86:15, but you, O Lord, are a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. Psalm 89:14, steadfast love and faithfulness go before you. Psalm 115:1, not unto us, O Lord, not unto us, but to your name give glory, for the sake of your steadfast love and your faithfulness. Great is his steadfast love toward us, and the faithfulness of the Lord endures forever. Praise the Lord. Psalm 117:2. There you are in the midst of your storm. There you are in the loneliness of your cave, and you need to be reminded, he loves me. He's faithful. This storm will somehow pass. Somehow God will fulfill his purpose for me because his love is steadfast and he is faithful. He will fulfill his purpose in me. Psalm 138:2, I bow down toward your holy temple And I give thanks to your name for your steadfast love and for your faithfulness, for you have exalted above all things your name and your word. He says, I'm going to bow down. I'm going to bow down and I'm going to give thanks for your steadfast love and your faithfulness. In your cave, remember to give thanks for God's steadfast love and his faithfulness. God's faithfulness endures forever. God's steadfast love will never end. You can never be separated from his love. And that is what will get you through the storm. I will send from heaven and save. He will send from heaven his steadfast love and his faithfulness. So I don't know how he's going to do it, but I know it'll be his love and his faithfulness that pull you through. That you can depend on. That you can run to. That you can trust. I know I've told the prayer group this before. We've used this in that example, but hear it again, please. Paul Cedar told of a part of his devotional life that became so precious to me as I heard this man of God share this testimony with a bunch of pastors. He was quoting Psalm 92, 1 and 2, which uses the same words in the English but different in the Hebrew. One of the words is different in the Hebrew, but I'll read it. Psalm 92, 1 and 2. It says, it is good to give thanks to the Lord and to sing praise to you, O Most High, to declare your steadfast love in the morning and your faithfulness every night. It is good to declare your steadfast love in the morning and your faithfulness every night. And he shared a very personal part of his life. He said every night, and he'd been married now 50-some years, he said every night for several of these years, probably over 40 of the years of his marriage, he said every night before we both drift off to sleep, I reach over and take the hand of my dear wife, and we just begin to utter thanks to God for his faithfulness during that day. We don't go to sleep until we've uttered something together of the faithfulness of God. It is good to give thanks to the Lord for his faithfulness every night. And he said, I awaken much earlier than my wife, so I do this part by myself. But he said, for all these years, I've not let my feet touch the floor, but what I laid in bed, and I began to give thanks that I would experience his loving kindness in the day ahead. What would that do for your life if you did that every day for 40 years or more? What would that do for you? If every night you didn't go to sleep until you thanked God for his faithfulness in that day. You reminded yourself and recounted things of that day of God's faithfulness. And you start every day by saying, Lord, I'm thanking you for your steadfast love. I'm thanking you that I will experience your love today. You need to remember that when you're in the cave. Well, let me begin to conclude. We've got something of God, a refuge of God. We've got something of man, responsibility of the believer. We've got something of God, the response of God. He will send. And now we end again with something of the believer, the resolve of the believer. In verses 7 through 11, David 4 times says, I will. I will. I will. He has made a choice. He has a determination. There is a resolve coming from his heart. My heart is steadfast. My heart is fixed. My heart is steadfast. I will. I will. I will. In other words, in the time of his cave experience, he made some decisions of some things he would make sure he did. We've already talked about crying out to God. But in verse 7 he says, I will sing and make melody. Verse 8 he says, I will awaken the dawn. What does that mean? I will awaken the dawn. I will start every day in the presence of God. Before the sun comes up, I will be in the presence of God. I will awaken the dawn. And then he even calls upon his musical instruments in a poetic way of saying a word that he will worship. He says, oh, awake, O harp, awake, O lyre. No, we've got to worship first thing of the day. I will do that. I will give thanks, verse 9. I will sing praises among the nations. I will. I will. When you're in the cave, when the storms of destruction are raging all around you, what is your determination? What is your resolve? Are you resolved to thank the Lord in the midst of all things? Are you resolved to worship the Lord every morning? Are you resolved to sing unto the Lord the glory that is only due to him? That's a resolve. That's a commitment. And you might not always feel it because you're in a cave. You're in a storm. Listen to Habakkuk 3:17. Though the fig tree may not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, nor their labor of the olive may fail, and the fields yield no food, the flocks may be cut off from the fold, and there's no herd in the stalls. I mean, wait a minute. It's just getting worse and worse and worse. Everything's dying. There's no food. Yet will I rejoice in the Lord. I will joy in the God of my salvation. The Lord is my strength. He will make my feet like a deer's feet. He will make me walk on my high places. He's saying, here's my resolve. Yet I will rejoice. I will sing. I will thank. I will awaken the dawn. That's his resolve. So when you're in a cave and you're focusing on God's steadfast love and faithfulness, praise him, worship him, not for the circumstance, but for his character, his love, his faithfulness. After all, he is your refuge. Focus on him. Last point. When you're in the cave, you're crying out to God. You're trusting God. When you're in the cave, you're focusing on his steadfast love and his faithfulness. But notice what he says twice in verse 7. My heart is steadfast. My heart is steadfast. One translation says, my heart is fixed. This is the word kun in the Hebrew, and it literally means to be firm, to be stable, to be established. It's used about how a God setting up the creation. It's established, it's firm. It's used about God setting up his throne. It's established, its throne is established. But in a cave, we must allow God to establish our heart. That we have a resolve that says, my heart is set on God. My heart is fixed on trusting him. My heart is steadfast. My heart is fixed. Psalm 10:17 says, Lord, thou hast heard the desire of the humble. You will prepare or establish kun. You will fix their heart. You will cause thine ear to hear. In other words, God, you're going to make my heart solid. Not hardened in that sense, but it's going to be solid toward you. And I saw something in this word I've never seen before. In Psalm 51:10, David is repenting, and he says, God, 51:10 of Psalm, God create in me a new heart, a clean heart. And then he says, renew a right spirit within me. And that word that is translated right is the same word kun. Literally what he was praying for is, God, not only cleanse me of my sin, but give me a solid, steadfast heart. A heart that is fixed on you, not a divided heart that'll wander again. Not a heart that has a love for the world and a love for God. No, I want a steadfast heart, oh God. Not only forgive me, give me a clean heart, but give me an established heart. Established toward you. Psalm 78:37 is the opposite of that. For their heart was not steadfast with him, nor were they faithful to his covenant. Psalm 112:7 and 8. He will not be afraid. The good man will not be afraid of evil tidings. His heart is kun, steadfast, trusting in the Lord. Then he uses another word, but he says his heart is established. He will not be afraid. So his heart, the good man, his heart is established before God. His heart is fixed, is steadfast toward God. So let me close simply by saying you're in a cave because you're in a storm. And I know you don't want to be in that cave, and you want to get out of that cave. But right now, you need to be in that cave. Because God is doing something in you. Something that you will look back upon and say, that cave was a part of his fulfilling his purpose for me. But see, I don't want you to die in the cave. I don't want you to fall apart in the cave. So remember, God is your refuge. Remember, you have a responsibility in that cave to be crying out to God. And be expectant, because God will respond. He will send. He will send. But something about the cave is to bring about a renewed resolve in our heart. I will. I will sing. I will praise. I will give thanks. My heart is fixed. My heart is steadfast. Hallelujah. Let's read that last phrase one last time from this beautiful psalm. For your steadfast love is great to the heavens, your faithfulness to the clouds. Be exalted, O God, above the heavens. Let your glory be over all the earth. How does he end? He ends by saying, I want something more than my deliverance. I want God to be glorified. I want his steadfast love and his faithfulness to be known. He will send it from heaven. So are you in a cave today? Are you going through some storm of destruction? Will you remember God as your refuge? Will you take your responsibility to be a person of prayer, and be crying out to him, knowing that God will respond by sending? Will you allow a new resolve to come to your heart, that your heart will be steadfastly fixed on him? You're in a cave, but you won't be there forever. You're in a storm, but it will pass. And after a storm, there's something of a freshness. There's something of a newness. And there's something in you because you were in the cave. Let's stand together, shall we? And